What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5C. So this video, we're going to be talking about another new feature that Canon introduced in firmware version 1.0.4.1, and that is the digital teleconverter. Now, I know there's some of you out there who are already reaching for the unsubscribe button, the thumbs down button, and leave a nasty comment about how stupid could I possibly be for wanting to talk about digital teleconverters. Everybody knows digital teleconverters are crap and you should never use them. Digital teleconverter, digital zoom, whatever you want to call it. And truthfully, I would be right there agreeing with you if we were talking about still photography. But when it comes to video, the situation is a little bit more open, a little bit different, specifically in the case of the R5C, because we have an 8K sensor, but we aren't necessarily going to be recording everything at 8K resolution. So if you're shooting at 4K resolution or you're shooting at 2K resolution, you have some leeway to how you want to use those extra pixels on the sensor. Now, obviously, downsampling is still going to give you the best quality image because anytime you downsample, you reduce noise, you improve dynamic range, everything gets better doing that. But you may not want to make that, or it may be worth making the trade-off for a little bit less image quality, for a little bit more reach in some situations where, depending on what you're doing, you might actually find that useful. Point is I don't like to be totally or dogmatic about this. I don't think digital teleconverters and digital zoom are great, but I want to know how they perform so that I can make an informed decision if I need to use one or if I want to use one as to whether or not it's going to be acceptable to do so, as opposed to just dogmatically saying never use it. So that's why we're talking about it, or that's why I'm talking about it. So let's start by talking about the capabilities, availability, and limitations of the digital teleconverter on the R5C. So first of all, this is only available in video mode. This is not available in photo mode. This is not an R5 feature or function. This is only something that's available on the R5C in video mode. The camera supports 4 enhanced magnifications or 4 digital teleconverter settings, assuming we ignore off, which is the 5th, I guess you could say. And these are 1.5 to 2.5 and 3x magnifications. So that's your range of digital zoom or teleconversion, if you will. Now, on top of that, the camera is capable of taking or using all of these any of these in all of the sensor formats that are available. So the R5C can do full frame, Super 35, and Super 16. So you can pick any of those modes and add any of the digital zoom or digital teleconverter on top of that. That can lead to some pretty ridiculous digital magnification, if you will, in specifically if you were shooting in Super 16 mode, which is already a 2.75x crop. Add 3x digital teleconversion to that, and you're talking about 8.25 times the magnification from full frame. So you're talking about like the equivalent of an 825 millimeter angle of view with just a 100 millimeter lens. That gets kind of ridiculous. Now, spoilers, although this really shouldn't be a spoiler, the image quality, if you do that, is not very good at all. But that is kind of how sort of ridiculous this is. Now, the digital teleconverter is only available if you're shooting in MP4 or XFAVC recording formats. It is not available if you shoot in RAW, which makes sense in some respects. I mean, honestly, if you're shooting in RAW, you're probably way more concerned about image quality than you are about a little bit of extra reach and losing that image quality. So you're probably not going to want to use digital teleconverters anyway, just because of the degradation in image quality that you have. Finally, due to the way Canon has implemented this, it actually makes the autofocus area bigger, which is a little bit bizarre in some cases, because if you are shooting full frame with the 3x digital teleconverter, you end up having a bigger autofocus point than you would have, a much bigger autofocus point at that, than you would have if you were shooting in Super 16 mode without the digital teleconverter on at all. And the difference there, of course, is 2.75x versus 3x, so not actually that much of a difference. So if you are interested in using this, the place to go to set this up is on the Camera Setup 5 menu page under Teleconverter. It will be the bottommost entry. This will reset to off if you change the camera sensor format. So if you're going from full frame to Super 35 or whatever, this will not stay anytime you change that. Now, I wanted to do this video with some great real world tests to show whether or not this was useful or not, or could be applied. Unfortunately, I'm recording this in the start of summer, and if you've been anywhere around paying attention to the weather this year, we're setting record temperatures pretty much everywhere around the globe. Florida is not the exception there. So since I can't do any kind of practical work, we are going to just be looking at synthetic tests. Now, synthetic tests do mean they are more critical, I guess you could say, of what you're going to be looking at. But the good news is if things look good in a synthetic test, they're almost certainly going to be good in practical situations. The tests are more demanding. So the way I tested this is I set my camera up on a tripod with RF 100 to 500 millimeter lens, and I adjusted the focal length to compensate for the teleconverter increase. So I kind of wanted an apples to apples. This is what it would look like optically without having the camera doing anything versus this is the closest possible comparison that I can give with the camera doing the digital teleconversion. So I did a series of tests. I used this test chart over my shoulder. I should note the step wedges that you can't really see, but they're in the middle here, are actual calibrated step wedges. They measure accurately. Unfortunately, because of the way this test was conducted, the reference numbers on them don't correspond to any real values. They're just reference numbers that you can use as a point of approximation if and when they are visible in the test. In any event, I set this up, camera lens on tripod, shooting at 300, 200, 150, and 100 millimeters, and that corresponded to no teleconverter for the 300, 1.5x for the 200, 2x for the 150, and 3x for the 100. I didn't bother testing the 2.5x. So I ended up actually testing this twice, largely because after looking at the results from the first test, I saw sort of a systemic issue that I thought might have been due to test protocols, and it didn't actually end up being as a result of test protocols. So I ended up with two sets of data that basically confirmed the same performance in both places. So the way I'm going to be talking about this is we're going to be looking at some test stuff. On the left side of the screen, you're going to have the digital teleconverted version of the test. In the right side, you're going to have the each of the digital teleconverter versions or steps through. These are 100% crops, so even though I am talking about like 8K and 4K resolutions, but this is a 2K resolution video, we aren't actually looking at the whole test area. We are looking at 100% pixel accurate crops out of the middle of the frame and dealing with that. You may also notice that in some cases, the area or the size of the tests is not exactly equal. This has to do with the fact that the 100 to 500 is an inner or a rear focusing or an inner focusing lens. This shifts the angle of view, and that shifted angle of view, as you focus closer than infinity, that shifted angle of view is going to be different at different focal lengths for the same focus distance, and that's going to be the primary factor in what you're seeing here. Additionally, because the camera and lens don't give you millimeter accurate focal lengths, there's also going to be some from that. So let's start looking at the tests, starting with full frame and full frame with 8K output as the target resolution. So this is probably the most compromised, or one of the two most compromised or compromising situations on the camera. The simple reality is when you have an 8K sensor, you can't actually crop in and still get 8K worth of information out of it. You're going to get less. So anything that's done in this case is going to be purely upscaled, cropped and upscaled on the camera, as opposed to something, potentially more accurate, like windowing and downscaling or something like that. That said, I was pretty surprised, actually, that 1.5 and 2x digital teleconversions were relatively good. I'm not going to suggest that you should probably use them, but I really expected them to look a lot worse than they did. And at least 1.5x, and that's going to be a running thing through this whole video, you could probably clean up to be good with a little bit of extra sharpening to look pretty spot on, certainly in normal viewing conditions at 8K. Now, that said, if you are shooting 8K, you're probably more concerned about resolution and image quality than if you were shooting at one of the lower output formats, so 4K or 2K. So you probably, in that situation, are still going to want to not use the digital teleconverter at all if you can avoid it. Stepping down the output resolution to 4K, and the situation is somewhat similar to what we saw in 8K, so 1.5x still looked pretty good to me. However, 2x actually looks a lot worse than I expected. Now, it's probably still going to be usable for some people in some cases, but it's really, I really would have expected a much better output at 2x than what we're actually seeing here, and I'll talk about why in a second. The other thing here is we really start to see noise ramping up as the digital teleconverter increases in magnification. So this is obviously going to be a byproduct of, downsampling improves noise performance, upsampling makes the noise more obvious, and you're going to see this again across all of the tests. The final full frame resolution test that we did, or full frame test that we did, is at 2K output resolution. And here I found that 1.5 and 2x digital teleconverter, or digital zoom, whatever you want to call it, is actually pretty usable. I didn't think that either of those were anywhere near as bad as the 4K results were. Again, we do see noise increasing with 2x and 3x as you would expect. And here again, just like I said with the 4K output, I really expected the 2K or the 2x and 3x performance to be better, especially the 3x performance. 3x here produces a worse picture than Super 16 mode does without the digital teleconverter. And the picture quality really should be basically on par with each other if Canon was doing this, I won't say intelligently, but in a way that optimized the image quality. So I sat down, calculated the effective resolutions that we should be looking at or working with. At 1.5x digital teleconverter, we should be looking at about 5462 by 2891 pixels from the sensor. So that's more than 4K resolution. So we should be able to that should be downsampled to 4K, and we should get a really good image, or a pretty good image out of that. 2K obviously should get a really good image out of that. At 2x digital teleconverter, we're talking about 4096 by 2160, which is DCI 4K straight up, native DCI 4K. And this is why I was so disappointed with the performance that I see in the 2x 4K output. It should be better. It should be pixel accurate. This should look really good. I mean, it's going to be noisier than downsampled 8K, but it should look a lot better than it does. And then for 3x, it's 2731 by 1440. A pixel area out of the sensor is what's being read. And this, again, is higher resolution than 2K. This should be being downsampled to 2K output format or output resolution, so we really should see a pretty decent image here, at least in the 2K mode, and we really aren't. So stepping the camera down to Super 35 format, the camera's only capable of 4K and 2K outputs here, and the story really is kind of the same in this situation. 1.5x looks pretty usable. 2x is starting to perform poorly or starting to show softness, although for some reason 2x here doesn't seem to be quite as bad as it did in some of the full frame tests I did, but it's still not really great. And then, of course, as you would expect, noise increases. That was for 4K output format or resolution. For 2K output resolution, again, same story. 1.5 is acceptable. 2x really starts to show softness, and 3x is just bad. So the story with the digital teleconverter in Super 35 mode really kind of continues the same thing. 1.5x is usable, 2x may be okay in some circumstances, but I'd still tend to avoid it. And again, I'm disappointed by the image quality, especially for 2K outputs. It seems like the camera should be able to do better for 2K. So again, calculating the effective pixel area that we should be talking about, for the 1.5x magnification, we should be talking about 3968 by 2093. So this isn't going to be 4K quality. It's not reading 4K out of the sensor, but it's pretty close to 4K resolution coming out of the sensor. So this shouldn't be actually very bad. I mean, this, I'm not going to say should be indistinguishable from native 4K, but it should be pretty close. 2x takes us down to 2976 by 1570 pixels in the sensor area, and this is obviously going to be no good for 4K. That's going to be upscaled. But for 2K, this is still going to be, should be downscaled to 2K resolution. So this still should really give a much better image than it does. And then at 3x for the digital teleconverter, we're down to 1984 by 1047. So this is definitely not native 2K resolution, but it's not far short. 1047 lines versus 1080 lines is a small difference. This should look a lot better than it does. So I've shot a lot of videos for this channel on a 5D Mark IV. It line skips its 1080p output from the full sensor area to ends up being down around 945 lines of actual resolution or information. So 945 compared to 1080 is, pretty significant. I think the quality on the 5D Mark IV 945 lines, or the resolution available with the 5D Mark IV and its 945 line output, is better than what I'm seeing here at what should be comparable to 1047 lines. It should be higher resolution. Like, this should almost look native HD quality or full HD quality. Dropping the sensor to the final mode, Super 16, the camera only does 2K output here. Again, same story along the whole thing. 1.5x is actually quite passable, even though that's right on the threshold of not even having enough resolution for 2K output. So it's the same 1047 versus 1080 lines. Everything else, for me at least, is a kind of a hard pass. And in most cases, they don't even have enough resolution for 720p if you're still using that. So 1.5x, again, doing the resolution calculations, 1.5x should be working with a 1984 by 1047 area on the sensor. So that's pretty close to 2K output resolution, but not quite. 2x drops that down to 1488 by 785, which is just barely better than 720p. And then 3x drops it all the way down to 992 by 523, which really suffers. So, conclusions. Overall, I'm actually somewhat disappointed in the image quality that I'm getting out of this. As you saw from the resolution calculations, there's a lot of cases where if you're shooting in 4K or especially 2K, the camera really should just be able to window into a smaller area of the sensor, read it out, and downsample that to the output that you're getting, and you should get a really good image from that, all things considered. Unfortunately, what it seems that Canon's doing, and I can't say this for certain, but given the quality loss, this really does seem to be kind of what's happening, is Canon is reading out the sensor, downsampling it to whatever output resolution you've selected, then cropping it and re-expanding it or something like that. Like, it doesn't seem like they're working through a single process tool chain. And the reason I say that ultimately comes down to the situation if you were shooting full frame, 2K saved or 2K output, and you have the digital teleconverter on to 3x crop, versus shooting in Super 16 mode without any digital teleconverter. Both should give you a 2K output file. With both of them should be about the same quality, and the reality is they're not. The Super 16 mode is considerably sharper than the full frame output, and they should both be working from, call it around 3K worth of resolution, downsampling that to around to 2K or 1920 by 1080, depending on which mode you're in. And that doesn't seem to be happening. So general rule of thumb here is I would definitely say that 1.5x is safe to use in most situations, or any situation where you really felt you needed to use the digital teleconverter. 2x can be acceptable, especially if you're working in the 2K resolutions. The image quality doesn't get degraded so much that it's bad, and a little extra sharpening is often enough to take it to being reasonably comparable to what you would be shooting in native 2K resolutions. That said, I wouldn't try 2.5 or 3x at all. I don't see any point in them given the way Canon's doing things on the camera. And even then, if I was really concerned about getting the best possible quality image out of the whole process, I would really think about just shooting in the regular sensor modes and then using AI upscaling techniques in post to give me the ability to digitally punch in with potentially a better quality image to work with. And by and large, that's kind of the biggest takeaway that I'm making from this, which is you're better off from an image quality perspective, at least based on the testing I've done, to shoot with a smaller crop sensor mode. So Super 35 for a 1.4x crop or Super 16 for a 2.75x crop than you are turning on the digital teleconverter to approximate that. So that is the digital teleconverter on the EOS R5C in video mode as of firmware 1.0.4.1. I hope you found this useful or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.